There exists a moment of profound psychological power that occurs exactly 5 seconds after anger first floods your nervous system. Carl Jung discovered this critical window during his analysis of what he called the shadow eruption process. Those terrifying moments when rage threatens to destroy relationships, careers, the carefully constructed persona you've spent years building. What Jung found will fundamentally change how you understand anger and why most people remain completely powerless against its destructive force throughout their entire lives. In those 5 seconds, your unconscious mind makes a decision that determines whether you'll become the master of your emotional life or remain forever enslaved to primitive impulses that betray your deepest values and sabotage your most important relationships. Jung documented this phenomenon across thousands of patients and discovered that people who learn to recognize and utilize this 5-second window develop what he called conscious authority, the ability to maintain psychological sovereignty even during the most intense emotional storms. But before we explore Jung's revolutionary method for transforming anger into psychological strength, I need to ask you something that might reveal how anger has been controlling your life without your awareness. How old are you, and where are you watching from? When you get angry, what do you do to calm yourself down? After subscribing to the channel and liking this video, write your experiences in the comments along with your name. Let's examine your story together. You can also send this video to your loved ones so they can learn these teachings too. What you're about to discover represents Jung's most practical psychological breakthrough, a technique so simple yet profound that it can literally rewire your relationship with anger in a matter of weeks. But here's what makes this particularly urgent for your psychological development. Every moment you spend unconscious during anger episodes, you're not just losing control of your emotions, you're actively programming your unconscious mind to repeat these destructive patterns with increasing intensity and frequency. Jung's 5-second rule emerged from his observation of what he called affect possession, those moments when powerful emotions completely overwhelm conscious control and transform otherwise rational people into what appears to be entirely different personalities. He noticed that anger doesn't just make people behave badly, it temporarily displaces their conscious identity and allows what Jung called shadow contents to completely dominate their personality expression. Think about the last time you experienced intense anger. Remember not just what triggered it, but how it felt in your body, how your thoughts changed, how your voice and gestures became completely different from your normal personality. In those moments, Jung observed, you weren't really yourself anymore. You had become temporarily possessed by an autonomous emotional complex that operated independently of your conscious values and intentions. Here's where Jung's discovery becomes both fascinating and disturbing. The person who emerges during anger episodes isn't a distorted version of your true self. It's actually a completely separate psychological entity that lives within your unconscious mind and waits for moments of emotional vulnerability to seize control of your personality. Jung called these entities shadow complexes, and he found that most people remain completely unaware of their existence until they begin doing serious psychological work. But Jung discovered something remarkable about the initial moments of anger eruption. There's a brief window, lasting approximately 5 seconds, where your conscious mind can still intervene before the shadow complex gains complete control. During these 5 seconds, you retain the power to choose whether you'll surrender to emotional possession or maintain conscious authority over your psychological state. Most people miss this window entirely because they've never been taught to recognize the early warning signs of affect possession. They experience anger as a sudden, overwhelming force that appears without warning and disappears just as mysteriously, leaving behind damaged relationships and deep shame about their behavior. Jung found that this unconscious approach to anger management guarantees increasing emotional instability and decreasing self-respect over time. The 5-second rule Jung developed provides a practical method for recognizing and utilizing this critical window before shadow possession occurs. But understanding this technique requires grasping something most people never realize about the nature of anger itself. Anger isn't just an emotion, it's actually a complex psychological process that involves multiple layers of unconscious material surfacing simultaneously in response to perceived threats to your psychological integrity. When something triggers your anger, what you're experiencing isn't simply irritation or frustration. You're experiencing the eruption of unconscious contents that have been accumulating psychological pressure over weeks, months, or even years. The immediate trigger, whatever someone said or did, isn't really what's making you angry. It's simply the final stimulus that causes your psychological pressure cooker to explode. Jung discovered that people who learn to recognize anger as a signal of accumulated unconscious pressure, rather than just a response to immediate circumstances, develop the capacity to address the deeper psychological issues that create emotional volatility. They begin to see anger episodes as opportunities for self-understanding, rather than just problems to be managed or suppressed. Here's where the 5-second rule becomes psychologically transformative. During those crucial first 5 seconds of anger eruption, Jung found that you can train yourself to ask a specific question that changes everything. What is my unconscious mind trying to tell me through this anger? This single question shifts you from unconscious reaction to conscious engagement with your emotional experience. But this shift requires understanding something most people never learn about anger's hidden intelligence. Jung discovered that anger often contains legitimate psychological information about boundary violations, unmet needs, or situations that genuinely threaten your psychological well-being. The problem isn't the anger itself, it's the unconscious way most people express and process angry feelings. When you apply Jung's 5-second rule consistently, you begin to recognize patterns in your anger that reveal important information about your psychological development needs. You might discover that certain types of people or situations consistently trigger anger because they remind your unconscious mind of unresolved trauma or unfinished psychological business from your past. Think about the types of behavior that make you most angry. Notice whether these behaviors share common themes, minus perhaps they involve dishonesty, disrespect, manipulation, or abandonment. Jung found that your strongest anger reactions often point toward your deepest psychological wounds and most important developmental needs. Understanding these patterns provides invaluable guidance for your personal growth and healing work. Jung documented 5 distinct types of anger that require different approaches within the 5-second rule framework. Understanding which type you're experiencing allows you to respond more skillfully and extract maximum psychological benefit from each anger episode rather than simply trying to suppress or control your emotional responses. The first type Jung identified is boundary anger, the rage that erupts when someone violates your psychological, emotional, or physical boundaries in ways that threaten your sense of safety or integrity. This anger often feels righteous and justified because it's protecting something genuinely important about your well-being and self-respect. Boundary anger serves a crucial psychological function by alerting you to situations where assertive action is necessary to protect your legitimate interests. Jung found that people who learn to recognize and honor boundary anger develop stronger self-respect and healthier relationships because they become skilled at communicating their limits clearly and enforcing them consistently. When you experience boundary anger, the 5-second rule involves asking what boundary is being violated here and how can I protect it effectively. This question helps you distinguish between legitimate boundary protection and unconscious overreaction based on past trauma or insecurity. The second type is projection anger, rage directed toward people who display qualities or behaviors that you haven't accepted in yourself. Jung discovered that we often become most angry with people who mirror our own shadow contents, unconscious aspects of our personality that we've rejected or denied. Projection anger feels particularly intense because it's fueled by internal psychological conflict rather than external circumstances. You're not really angry at the other person, you're angry at the parts of yourself that you see reflected in their behavior but haven't integrated into your conscious self-concept. When experiencing projection anger, the 5-second question becomes, what does this person's behavior reveal about aspects of myself that I haven't accepted or integrated? This inquiry transforms anger into an opportunity for psychological growth and increased self-awareness. The third type Jung identified is developmental anger, minus frustration that arises when life circumstances force you to confront psychological growth challenges that you'd prefer to avoid. This anger often emerges during major life transitions, relationship changes, or career developments that require expanding your identity or capabilities. Developmental anger feels overwhelming because it's connected to your unconscious resistance to necessary psychological growth. Part of you recognizes that change is needed, but another part wants to maintain familiar patterns, even when they no longer serve your well-being or authentic expression. The 5-second question for developmental anger is, what growth is being demanded of me right now, and how can I embrace it rather than resist it? This reframe helps you recognize anger as a signal that you're being called to expand beyond your current psychological limitations. The fourth type is historical anger, rage, that's triggered by current situations, but actually originates from unresolved trauma or unfinished emotional business from your past. This anger often feels disproportionate to present circumstances because it's fueled by accumulated psychological wounds that haven't been properly processed or healed. Historical anger can be particularly destructive because it's often directed toward people who don't deserve the intensity of your emotional reaction. You're not really angry at them, you're angry at people or situations from your past, but your unconscious mind has transferred these feelings onto current relationships. When experiencing historical anger, the 5-second question becomes, who or what from my past am I really angry at, and how can I address that original wound rather than projecting it onto this current situation? This inquiry helps you distinguish between past and present emotional material. The fifth type, Jung identified, is spiritual anger, rage, that emerges when you feel disconnected from meaning, purpose, or authentic self-expression. This anger often manifests as frustration with society, institutions, or life circumstances that seem to prevent you from living according to your deepest values and aspirations. Spiritual anger can feel existential and overwhelming because it's connected to your soul's demand for authentic expression and meaningful contribution. It's your unconscious mind's way of protesting against living inauthentically or settling for less than your true potential. The 5-second question for spiritual anger is, how is my current life situation preventing me from expressing my authentic self, and what changes need to be made to align my external circumstances with my internal truth? This inquiry transforms anger into motivation for meaningful life changes. Understanding these 5 types of anger allows you to apply Jung's 5-second rule more skillfully, because you can tailor your response to the specific type of psychological material that's surfacing. But Jung discovered that most people need extensive practice before they can consistently recognize and utilize the 5-second window effectively. The key to developing this skill lies in understanding what Jung called the anger signature, the unique pattern of physical sensations, emotional responses, and cognitive changes that occur in your body and mind during the initial moments of anger eruption. Everyone has a slightly different anger signature, and learning to recognize yours is essential for applying the 5-second rule successfully. Most people experience anger as a sudden overwhelming force, but Jung found that anger actually builds through identifiable stages that can be recognized with proper attention and training. The first stage involves subtle physical changes, perhaps tension in your jaw, heat in your chest, or a particular sensation in your stomach that precedes conscious awareness of anger. The second stage involves emotional changes, a shift in your overall feeling tone, from neutral or positive to irritated or threatened. This stage often includes the beginning of what Jung called narrative construction, your mind starting to create stories about why you're justified in feeling angry. The third stage involves cognitive changes. Your thinking becomes more rigid, black and white, and focused on blame or punishment. This is when your rational mind begins to be overwhelmed by emotional intensity, making conscious choice increasingly difficult. The fourth stage is full shadow possession, when anger completely overwhelms your conscious control, and you begin acting in ways that contradict your normal values and intentions. Once you reach this stage, applying the 5-second rule becomes much more difficult because your conscious mind has already been displaced by unconscious emotional complexes. Jung's 5-second rule is most effective when applied during the first or second stage of anger development, before emotional intensity overwhelms your capacity for conscious choice. This requires developing what he called emotional self-awareness, the ability to notice subtle changes in your internal state before they escalate into overwhelming emotional experiences. Developing this awareness requires what Jung considered essential for psychological health: the willingness to pay close attention to your internal experience, rather than remaining unconsciously focused on external circumstances. Most people spend so much mental energy analyzing and reacting to what's happening around them that they never develop sensitivity to their own emotional processes. But Jung found that people who invest time in developing emotional self-awareness gain tremendous psychological advantages. They become less reactive, more resilient, and better able to maintain conscious choice, even during challenging interpersonal situations. They develop what he called psychological sovereignty, the ability to maintain their center regardless of external circumstances. Here's where Jung's approach becomes particularly practical for daily life. He develops specific exercises for building the emotional awareness necessary to recognize your anger signature and apply the 5-second rule consistently. These exercises require only a few minutes daily, but can dramatically improve your emotional regulation and relationship quality over time. The first exercise involves what Jung called body scanning, spending a few minutes each day systematically noticing physical sensations throughout your body, particularly in areas where you typically experience emotional tension. This practice develops the somatic awareness necessary to recognize the early physical signs of anger eruption. The second exercise involves emotion tracking, briefly noting your emotional state several times throughout the day and identifying any subtle shifts or changes in your feeling tone. This practice helps you recognize the emotional stage of anger development before it escalates to shadow possession. The third exercise is trigger identification, reviewing anger episodes after they occur and identifying the specific thoughts, memories, or interpretations that transformed initial irritation into full emotional overwhelm. This practice helps you recognize the cognitive patterns that fuel anger escalation. The fourth exercise involves conscious breathing during the 5-second window, taking one deep conscious breath while asking Jung's transformative question about what your unconscious mind is trying to communicate through the anger experience. Jung found that people who practice these exercises consistently for several weeks begin to notice dramatic improvements in their ability to remain conscious during anger episodes. They start catching themselves earlier in the anger process and maintaining rational thought even during intense emotional experiences. But Jung discovered something even more remarkable about people who master the 5-second rule. They often report that their relationships improve dramatically because they're no longer unconsciously damaging their connections through uncontrolled anger expressions. They become more trustworthy and emotionally mature because people know they won't suddenly become verbally or emotionally abusive during conflicts. These individuals also develop what Jung called emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize and respond skillfully to emotional dynamics in themselves and others. They become better partners, parents, friends, and colleagues because they can maintain psychological stability and conscious choice even during intense interpersonal challenges. Think about how your life might change if you could consistently remain conscious and centered during anger episodes. Imagine maintaining your dignity and values even when others are behaving badly. Consider how your relationships might deepen if people knew they could trust you to handle conflicts maturely and constructively. Jung observed that people who develop mastery over their anger often experience increased self-respect and confidence because they know they can handle challenging situations without betraying their own values or damaging their important relationships. They develop what he called inner authority, confidence that comes from knowing you can maintain psychological integrity regardless of external circumstances. But Jung also discovered potential challenges that people face when learning to apply the 5-second rule. The most common difficulty involves what he called shadow resistance, conscious parts of your personality that actually enjoy the temporary sense of power and release that comes from anger expression, even though it ultimately damages your relationships and self-respect. Shadow resistance can manifest as rationalization about why anger expression is justified, minimization of the damage caused by anger episodes, or subtle sabotage of your efforts to develop better emotional regulation. Jung found that acknowledging these internal conflicts honestly is essential for making genuine progress with anger management. Another common challenge involves what Jung called anger addiction, the unconscious dependence on anger as a primary method for feeling powerful, getting attention, or avoiding vulnerable emotions like hurt, fear, or sadness. People who are anger addicted often resist learning better emotional regulation because they're afraid of losing their primary coping mechanism. Jung discovered that anger addiction often develops in childhood as a survival mechanism in families where expressing vulnerability was dangerous, but expressing anger provided some sense of protection or control. Adults who carry this pattern need patience and compassion with themselves as they learn healthier ways of accessing personal power and emotional safety. A third challenge involves what Jung called perfectionism paralysis, becoming so focused on applying the 5-second rule perfectly that you become self-critical and discouraged when you occasionally fail to catch anger episodes early enough. Jung emphasized that developing emotional mastery is a gradual process that requires patience and self-compassion rather than rigid perfectionism. The key to overcoming these challenges lies in understanding what Jung considered the ultimate purpose of anger work. The goal isn't to eliminate anger or become emotionally controlled and repressed. The goal is to develop conscious relationship with your emotional life so that your feelings serve your growth and relationships rather than unconsciously sabotaging them. Jung found that people who approach anger work with curiosity rather than judgment make much faster progress because they're able to learn from their emotional experiences rather than simply trying to suppress or control them. They develop what he called psychological flexibility, the ability to respond to emotional challenges with wisdom rather than rigid rules or unconscious habits. Here's what Jung discovered about people who consistently apply the 5-second rule over extended periods. They often report feeling more authentic in their relationships because they're no longer hiding behind anger or walking on eggshells to avoid triggering their own or others' emotional volatility. They become more genuine and emotionally honest because they can handle the full range of human emotional experience with consciousness and skill. These individuals also develop what Jung called emotional courage, the willingness to feel difficult emotions fully without immediately reacting or trying to escape through anger, blame, or other defensive mechanisms. They become more resilient and psychologically mature because they can process challenging experiences without being overwhelmed or traumatized by them. Jung observed that emotional courage is particularly important for maintaining intimate relationships because it allows you to stay present and connected with others, even during conflicts or difficult conversations. Instead of escalating into anger or withdrawing emotionally, you can remain engaged and work through challenges constructively. But perhaps most importantly, Jung found that people who master the 5-second rule often experience what he called psychological integration, the gradual unification of conscious and unconscious aspects of their personality that leads to greater wholeness, authenticity, and life satisfaction. This integration occurs because working skillfully with anger requires acknowledging and accepting previously rejected aspects of yourself. As you learn to understand anger as communication from your unconscious mind rather than just emotional dysfunction, you begin to reclaim psychological energy that was previously trapped in internal conflict and self-rejection. Remember that moment when you handled a potentially explosive situation with grace and wisdom instead of reactive anger. That experience represents your capacity for conscious emotional mastery that becomes increasingly available as you develop skill with Jung's 5-second rule. The more you practice this approach, the more natural and automatic it becomes to respond to challenges with consciousness rather than unconscious reactivity. Jung's 5-second rule represents far more than just an anger management technique. It's a gateway to developing the kind of emotional maturity and psychological sovereignty that allows you to maintain your authentic self, even during life's most challenging and intense experiences. It's an invitation to become the kind of person who can be trusted with power, because you've learned to wield your emotional energy consciously and constructively. Your anger has been trying to teach you something important about your psychological development and authentic self-expression. The question is whether you're ready to listen with the consciousness and respect that Jung discovered transforms destructive rage into wisdom, personal power, and deeper connection with yourself and others. Which type of anger do you recognize most in your own experience? Share in the comments how Jung's 5-second rule might help you transform your relationship with anger, and describe the most challenging anger situation you've faced recently. Your unconscious mind is ready to begin this conversation whenever you're prepared to engage with the consciousness and commitment it deserves.